check this. This is the hard knock life, but not the chicka kind. More like the people in the world seeking perspectives with a different line. The kids who share the interest together with a similar kind. When they said Don Glover for Spider-Man,
Welcome back to Hard NOC Life. I am your host, Keith Chow. We have gathered again to talk some things that have been happening in the news, because stuff stops not happening in the news and we have to keep talking about them. And one of those things that keep happening is we keep finding out actors of color get passed over for roles that should go to them. So let's bring on our honorary co-host of Hard NOC Life, Ms. Lexi Alexander. Welcome back, Lexi.
Thank you for having me back on my own podcast, which I call my own.
Sure, hey. And anytime. This is, like I said, you are guest co-host, honorary emeritus forever and ever. Whenever you wanted to be on the show, just give me a call and we'll accommodate you.
That's what we do.
I also wanted to bring on my other guest. He is the co-host of the No Totally podcast. Please welcome the one and only Shaun Lau.
Hey, how's it going? Very, very glad to speak once again with my friend Lexi and my new friend Keith.
Yeah, we've become fast friends on the internet, and it's because Hollywood is racist, and we're comrades in arms over that. So,
you know, I mean, the one thing I have to say about that, and I'm glad you brought that up, like the one thing that has happened with this whole thing of one movie after another that's completely erasing Asians is that it has suddenly made an organized Asian community on at least on Twitter that I can see. I wish that would happen to Arab Twitter, but Jesus Christ, we're fucking tribal even on Twitter. It's a nightmare, but maybe it has to happen to us in such a one after another way, although we already had so many of those movies. But that's a really cool thing. All Asian actors have spoken out, all prominent ones, all of you guys have written great stuff. So if there's one positive thing about that, it's that.
I got to give some credit too for the April Rain, the creator of the Oscar So White hashtag, and Mickey Kendall on Twitter for the community of Asians, because before Oscars night there were a lot of kind of disparate voices and they were all kind of competing, but the whole Not Your Mule hashtag that got revived, I think, really made a lot of Asian American activists sit up and think and realize that it's really up to us to use our voices rather than trying to piggyback on the black movement.
Also, my friend Rebecca Vachon is in that group. She goes under La Femme Fatale. Femme Fatale, yeah. She's been a big voice on Asian erasure in the entertainment industry for a long time.
She has been, yep. She's wonderful.
First of all, just to kind of like set the context, you know, there's been a lot of, you know, we've already talked about, in a certain extent, this Doctor Strange trailer dropping with Tilda Swinton as the Ancient One, who we've now learned is Celtic, so she's not even Asian. Hashtag Asian so Celtic, and then you had the Scarlett Johansson thing, of course, and then the Death Note casting, and you know, just recently the Robert Rodriguez has been attached to Battle Angel Alita. All of these anime adaptations without specifically Asian actresses or actors in the mix. I did a thing, not to toot my own horn. I wrote a thing in the New York Times. It's right here.
Yeah. You can toot your own horn.
My fellow New York Times columnist.
And it was like, my God, how many, I saw like one famous actor after another tweeted. Just after I said, oh my God, look at that, Kerry Washington retweeted it, somebody else retweeted it.
Yeah, that was probably the most surreal aspect of this whole thing. Like, not as surreal seeing your byline in the New York Times, but like having people like Daniel Day Kim and Sandra Oh and Kerry Washington kind of like retweeting and saying, read this article. I'm like,
Lucy Liu, that's who it was, right?
Yeah, Lucy Liu, yeah, even Lucy Liu. I'm like, who am I to argue with Sandra Oh or Kerry Washington?
Yeah.
No, but I think
that's
it was,
amazing.
I mean, and I appreciate that, but you know, it was something that needed to be said. And I think just the exposure of something like this being in somewhere like the New York Times kind of has all of these people coalescing around it. And I think it's important because it's definitely an issue. And it's not an issue that's exclusive to Asian Americans, but I feel like, especially lately with all of these movie announcements coming out, we're kind of getting the brunt. So Shaun, as an Asian American kind of like, you know, cultural critic, what's been your reaction?
It's difficult because one of the things that I've been really focusing on, especially lately, is the idea that Asian representation in film is a really harmful thing, right? Like, I was encouraged to share the story recently of how when I was a kid and I fell in love with Spider-Man comics, I begged my mom for a couple years to let me change my last name to a white last name because I didn't think that Asian people were allowed to do good things in the world. And so I've got a nephew who's around that age right now, and you know, you can kind of see a little bit of white supremacy creeping in, and we're at this stage right now where I think we focus on Marvel, and I think we do so rightly because that's children's entertainment. That's part of the demographic they're going for, and what we're telling a whole another generation of Asian Americans is that they're really not good enough to be heroes, and they're not good enough to make a positive difference in people's lives. And I mean, I think looking at Mr. Keith Chow in the New York Times and looking at what a lot of really great Asian American activists have been doing, that's just completely untrue.
Yeah, well, I don't think anyone cares that I'm in the New York Times. But
No, we do care. We do care. We do care, and I also find that, I mean, I would say it's funny because, you know, to use a trope, in all my years of being a martial artist, that's probably the one arena I've met the least Asians. And I've met them in all other arenas more, that I've never seen them portrayed on screen. So there's definitely something to be said. And I would say, I mean, I always look at, like, when we have these intersectional moments with the Oscars and everything, and all of a sudden all the minority groups are arguing in a big kind of divide and conquer scenario. Mm-hmm. There's part of me, you know, I have to be honest, sometimes I see what's going on, you know, like somebody's complaining about something, and Arab me will be sitting there thinking, ha, you know, we're not even a race. We don't even exist as part of the conversation. Right. I mean, it is like that, you know. Like, I mean, literally, nobody even gets upset about, like, the people think there is no Arabs in town. But what I have noticed is, I mean, what I've learned about this conversation is that America is still obsessed with Asian culture. Absolutely obsessed with it, and still continues to erase all representation, which is quite mind-blowing, and rightly so. People are upset about it.
The writer Kelly Kanayama wrote a really great piece, and I think, I can't remember the title off the top of my head, but it was something to the effect of, they love our culture as long as it's without us. And yeah, I mean, just like you said, Lexi, it's completely true. And the idea, again, that our culture boils basically down to a mass of signifiers that says, you know, mystical and inscrutable, while at the same time we're not really allowed to be seen as heroic or anything like that. It's just, it feels, the word appropriation is the word you want to use, but at the same time that word doesn't quite dig deep enough into the human cost and how it feels to have your culture ripped off like that, while at the same time, you know, it seems like they're telling you to just keep quiet and stay out of the picture. And I feel
that's the most insulting part, I have to say. Any kind of, like, well, let me tell you what this really is about. And let me tell you something. I can't say this with, I'm not speaking for anybody. I'm only speaking with, how do you say that? Let's put it this way. I've made a movie, and I am a filmmaker, and I have friends. And I can tell you with 100% certainty in my head that nobody at Marvel sat at the table and said, well, let's not piss off the Chinese. Like, people at some point when they go on a press tour, and this will all come out, when they all start talking and said, no, this wasn't part of our conversation, everybody who's writing a think piece now because the writer had a moment and wanted to be on a podcast is going to be so embarrassed, because I promise you that is not Kevin Feige's spiel. Like, I know of other movies where they have literally changed the Chinese bad guys to the Korean bad guys. I mean, I know this happens, but this isn't on their agenda. And maybe even it's worse, because, you know, part of it makes you think, well, if there wasn't a major financial reason, like, what the heck were you thinking? And, you know, part of why I really wanted to do this podcast with you guys is I know the filmmaker, the director, who hasn't spoken at all, Scott Derrickson, who is, of all the guys, and people know this, I've never come to the defense of a white male director. I have much better things to do. And certainly I'm not in the business of doing that. But this happens to be a guy who I know is socially conscious. He's conscious about any of those issues. He certainly wants to listen, wants to learn. I can't exactly, like, I knew when in the beginning when he was doing this movie, like certain things that he was thinking about and doing. He's not unaware of the erasure issue. I'm sure he didn't think that casting Tilda Swinton because it's a woman makes up for Asian erasure. But I also think like he's the wrong guy to like, boycott, because we have and the bar is very low. We have so few allies though among those type of directors that I would hate it to hit the one guy who actually, has really a sensitivity to this issue.
Before we go any further, I want to just take a step back and kind of like set the frame for what we're talking about, and that's in particular we're talking about the Doctor Strange featuring Benedict Cumberbatch as Doctor Strange and Tilda Swinton as the Ancient One, who is his like mentor, teacher, who teaches him how to be, Doctor Strange basically. And part of what Lexi and Shaun are talking about is the screenwriter of the film, Robert Cargill, was on another podcast, and he was explaining the minefield of trying to adapt a character like the Ancient One, who is in the comics, very stereotypical kind of wise old Asian man. How it's really tricky to write a character like that in today's world, especially making reference to Tibet in a box office where China is a big player is problematic. And Shaun, why don't you take it from there, just kind of explaining. Since you actually wrote a really great takedown of his whole reasoning in Medium, can you talk a little bit about what Cargill was trying to say as far as why they did what they did, what Lexi was referencing as far as Ancient One and Doctor Strange?
Yeah, sure. So Cargill, like you said, he appeared on this podcast, and the question was asked of him by a listener to the podcast: what was the argument behind casting Tilda Swinton instead of casting an Asian person for the Ancient One? And Cargill, I guess depending on how mean I want to be, Cargill basically, I'm going to be very blunt. Cargill, in my opinion, proved that he does not care about Asian people, proved that he is probably a racist. And I know that's the worst thing you can call a white person is racist, right? Like, it's the N-word for white people. But like, what I'm saying here is basically that I don't think that he humanizes Asian people in his head when he speaks, because what he did in response was to say that there was no way for he and the other writers to win this situation because the social justice warriors were going to complain about whatever they did regardless. And in my opinion, if he was really engaging with the issues, what he would say is, look, here's how we think we could have tried to respect Asian culture by what we did. But instead, what he said was, we can't do anything without everybody getting pissed off about it. I think the idea that you can't understand outrage and react to it as if it's just outrage and not something that's raising a legitimate point is, very dehumanizing. So it was a response that was very patronizing. It was, as mentioned earlier, it was kind of very Max Landis. If you're upset, then that means that you don't understand what's going on. As I mentioned in my piece, he doesn't mention Asian people really. He just says internet outrage is something that I could not have avoided, so here's what I did instead. He certainly tried to make the excuse that casting Tilda Swinton, casting a woman in a role that's typically male, or that is male in the comic books, that should have appeased people somehow. Again, thinking of activists, thinking of marginalized groups as all one thing, thinking that there's such things as diversity trading cards, that you can just kind of trade in a black person for a woman, or a woman for an Asian person, or anything like that. Again, dehumanizing, right? So I feel like what he wanted to do was respond to the internet outrage without engaging at all with the idea that what we're here for, or what I'm here for, and I think what you're here for as well, Keith, and as well as a lot of our allies like Lexi, is that the lack of representation and the misrepresentation and the commodification of Asian Americans and Asian American culture is harmful. It's legitimately harmful. It has human cost, and it's not something that you can just boil down to, hey, I'm writing a movie for the most powerful entertainment company in the world right now, and my whole method is I'm going to try to avoid getting mean things tweeted at me. That's a complete shirking of responsibility.
Right. But I gotta say this, and this is really what bothers me about this. All of your points are obviously right, and all of everybody's points were absolutely right about this. he went on a podcast and talked out of his ass. Like half of the stuff he was talking about is untrue, and he just made it up. And as he's later stated, and unfortunately those tweets didn't make the news, he was talking for himself. He wasn't talking for Marvel. Half of that stuff happened before he was even on. And I mean,
he actually got published in the New York Times with that clarification, I believe.
I think later he had to write another clarification, which he still, I mean, look, that guy does not understand the issue at all, which is why, I mean, look, let's be honest about that. It is the worst thing that you can call them, but I mean, I meet those guys all the time, you know, like they constantly say racist or sexist things, and yet if you call them racist or sexist, they'll be like, are you kidding me? I have 3 daughters, you know, I have a black neighbor, like this is their thing. They don't comprehend that the stuff that they say is absolute racist, right? But the worst thing that could happen is for a director who actually is somewhat socially conscious and is actively trying to learn more about it, to have the writer who basically is also under a non-disclosure agreement, who shouldn't be talking, have him speak for the whole thing and pop out these like facts that aren't even true. And again, that doesn't mean that this movie doesn't have major issues, but what's really unfair is that he just represented it as a fact, like this whole thing about like, oh yeah, nobody's talking about that it's not a man, it's a woman. Like, I know for sure that's not how Scott thinks. You know, he never once thought that, oh, if I put in a woman, I'll have some money in the back with the social justice warriors. That's not who this. That's not who this is at all. But that's how this guy made it sound. You know. Mm-hmm. And again, like, I mean, like those people, it's actually funny because there's really like a certain level. And Frank Stallone, who I don't know, but somebody tweeted him in my timeline today, and I was just like, for 10 minutes, I was amazed at this guy's rage at PC culture. and I mean, like, it was like a mental breakdown, and that's the thing. You know, people have written about it and said it much better than me, but old white guys are having a fucking heart attack about the fact that people like us have a microphone suddenly. Because, you know, I go back to an article that my friend Miriam Bale once tweeted about, which was, I was stunned by this knowledge about when they first talked about making Gone with the Wind. There were all these groups, these basically social justice warrior groups, that came forward and said, you can't make this book into a movie. This is a huge problem for the black community. At that time, imagine that. So these guys were there was all these groups actively protesting and meeting with studio executives saying, please do not make this movie. This is really bad for us. And this was the communication, like almost, a century ago. And so, you know, to like disregard this is just stupid and ridiculous. I think we just have to, like, once we ignore the Robert Cargills and the Frank Stallones and every other old white racist dude who keeps talking about social justice warriors, what I really would like to get at is the next point of, like, the people who want to change something. Is where can they do and what can they do? And what I'm noticing in conversations with friends about this is the companies just don't hire anybody who know. Like, I could give them 10 people they could, you know, take counsel from on any of these issues, and it would cost a company like that nothing to have some of these people on as just like a diversity task force that can like flag those issues before. But they don't do it, and that's a much bigger issue for me. Like, why are we at this place where somebody who actually does care, but who doesn't have maybe, like, you know, there could well be, and again, I'm not speaking for him. I'm speaking only as somebody who I made my own movies that didn't pass the Bechdel test. And if you've seen Punisher, every trope, the Asian gang, the black gang with the guns holding like that, like, I basically just copied the Marvel panels because I was so nervous of fucking up that I thought I have to get this right. I wasn't even thinking of any kind of social issues, right? So you have somebody in there who actually does think about it. And I feel like, how do we get to a place where we actually, you know, what do we do with this Marvel stuff that is set in these Asian tropes and people want to stick to it? Like, I mean, I'm really honestly, I would love to have a competition on Twitter or on any kind of social media where people pitch a version of this that would have really like represented both Asian culture and Asian Americans well.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that's kind of like has been bubbling under the surface about all of this Doctor Strange stuff was basically what the hashtag A Iron Fist was about like several months ago, and it's this idea that yes, we acknowledge that these comic books were created in the 60s and 70s, which were problematic times for Asian people in particular in terms of like how we're represented, but and then there are long-held stereotypes of like the Asian martial artist, the old Asian mystic. Like these things are tropes and they are stereotypes. And I think one of the arguments against A Iron Fist way back when was this idea that like, why do you want the only like superhero who's a kung fu guy to be Asian? Like, isn't that holding back your cause and everything? And it's like, I think part of what Lexi, what you're getting at is this idea that what we're advocating in terms of like representation for Asian American actors to portray these characters is not beyond the pale. It's not like we're trying to go and erase your childhood or bastardize or rape your childhood and all those kind of stupid things. It's about like, we acknowledge that these characters are problems and we're actually trying to help you figure out a way to tell these stories in ways that aren't problematic. And I think that's the thing. Like there is a way to tell the Doctor Strange story and not have it be this like another example of the white guy who goes to Asia to learn how to be the best Asian in the world, right? Which Doctor Strange falls, especially with Benedict Cumberbatch and Tilda Swinton. Like it's like, how do we avoid these racist tropes? Well, let's cast the whitest people in the world.
Well, and that's, I mean, that is the dumbest thing in the world. I mean, and by the way, I mean, it's not like this whole idea. Even when I saw you, Keith, on the whole Iron Fist thing, arguing with fellow Asian people. And other people of color, nerds of color, about like, well, like this is really a stereotype. Are you kidding me? You actually promoting the idea of an Asian martial artist? Like, dude, are you serious? Like Bruce Lee was our only movie star. What are you talking about? Like we're erasing everything right now? We have nobody then if we're erasing this. Like that makes total sense to me. And anybody who says something else. But what I would really like this whole, I mean, the writer who is not the smartest tool in the box, but he did, what did he call it? The whole scenario, the no-win.
The Kobayashi Maru.
Right. Like I wish that people would actually tweet scenarios, because I think that we have to educate people, because there is really good people stuck, and I'm not saying that I wouldn't be, but because I know my stereotypes really well of the Arab world, but you may not know all of the stereotypes that I don't ever want to see. Like, I mean, I don't know if either one of you would be in charge of making a movie about Muslims. Like, would you know how to deal with women in the hijab? Of like this whole idea of like, do they want to wear it? Do they wear it because they're obsessed? These are all, complicated issues that what you really should be doing is hiring somebody who knows these issues. But we are living in a world where there are filmmakers. We don't have, like, that's a whole other issue, that there's too many, but there will always be white guys telling Marvel stories. And in that world, like, I think we really, and we could do this with, like, tweeting scenarios at them, like, how could we have changed this? Like, of course, the obvious answer is Doctor Strange could have been Asian, right? And in the absence of that, though, let's say they would have said, let's not whitewash the Asian one. Like, what could this character have been that Asian Americans would have said, okay, you've done the best with this possible? Like, I don't see that there's no way of writing this character in a non-idiotic way, or?
Yeah, I have a bunch of thoughts on this, actually. Like, first of all, I think it's been really disingenuous for people to say what they did by casting white people is avoid racist stereotypes, because first of all, the comic books still have a lot of these characters in existence, like the Mandarin, the Ancient One. The comic books still currently use them, but they use them in a much less offensive way, because comic books, since the creation of these characters, in some cases 50 years ago, they've recognized that there's a lot of offensiveness and there's a lot of dehumanization in the portrayal of these characters. So in the comics, a lot of these things have grown up and become more complex and fleshed out. I mean, Cargill himself even says that since the 80s and 90s, the Ancient One really hasn't been as much of a racist trope. My question is, and I agree with you, Lexi, I think that there's a lot of people out there, smart Asian Americans, who really could be consulted, but even if they don't want to take that extra step, if they don't want to break that, famous Marvel secrecy, they could bring in people from the comic books because they're handling it a billion times better right now than the people in the movies are.
Question. I keep thinking that. I'm like, how are the comic book writers so much better at this?
Yeah, so to me, that speaks to how little Marvel cares. People have been telling me that Marvel has been really great with diversity. Oh, look at War Machine, look at Black Panther. First of all, again, we're not a monolith. Marginalized communities aren't all fighting. We're all fighting for the same thing, but we're not all on the same path. So it's totally ridiculous to say I should be satisfied because Black Panther is going to get a movie. I'm super excited about it. I think it's probably going to be great based on the talent they have, but that doesn't fix Asian representation in Marvel movies, right? And I think that's very obvious. Like, take a look at Ultron's backstory. I'm not sure how familiar you two are with it, but Ultron's backstory.
Keith knows everything.
Yeah, I'm assuming Keith knows it. That's one of my favorite origin stories for a villain, because Ultron is essentially, he's the kind of in the right mindset kind of dude that kind of goes about it the wrong way. Like, he wants peace on Earth. He sees that the Avengers often are in the middle of non-peaceful situations, and so he kind of misunderstands the directive and ends up kind of seeing the Avengers as his #1 target. It also goes to Hank Pym, who invented him, being a pacifist. It brings in all these really interesting concepts about what it means to be a superhero and a human at the same time. And that's kind of the genesis of Ultron, painted broadly. They changed that origin story in the Age of Ultron movie and made Ultron's backstory far less interesting. So the people who kind of come at us, Keith, me and you specifically, when we set out these alternate scenarios like you did with Asian Iron Fist, it doesn't make sense to me how people are like, oh, you need to stick with the canon, otherwise it's a completely different thing. Every single movie has featured a deviation from the origin story. My question is, why is it that the origin story only matters when you're trying to cast an Asian person?
Well, because canon only matters if it's white people. Because
Yep.
I mean, what you just said about Asian Iron Fist. I mean, we've actually, we partnered with MCU Exchange during the whole Asian Iron Fist thing, and we had long, like 10,000 word pitches of what an Asian Iron Fist story could be and what could it look like, and it was meticulously researched, and shout out to MC Nadelsky for that. Like, these things were written and they were out there, but I think the pushback against that was, well, that's not the canon. The canon is Danny the white blonde guy. And it's like, canon only matters if it's able to center whiteness. Because the thing about, you talk about canon, we're going back to Doctor Strange, apparently Tilda Swinton's not playing the Ancient One as depicted in the comics, who's a Tibetan man, but she's playing a Celtic woman. And so, like, they're fine with altering the canon so long as it erases the Asian and makes that Asian person now a white person. But if you do it the other way around, if you say, how can we make this white person an Asian American person, then, oh my God, all hell breaks loose. Because, like what Lexi was saying, part of my, I'm actually less upset with Tilda Swinton as the Ancient One as I am with Benedict Cumberbatch as Doctor Strange. Like, I feel like that is the lazy casting. And I know that he's probably had talks with Marvel, and they wanted him in a Marvel movie and they just found the vehicle for him. But still, Stephen Strange is the perfect character in this Marvel Cinematic Universe to cast a person of color. It doesn't have to necessarily be an Asian American, but any person of color. Oscar Isaac would have been dope as if he wasn't already Apocalypse, and I guess you can't be more than one Marvel movie.
That's not fair. Oscar Isaac would work for anything.
Yeah, Oscar Isaac can be in anything. But I was even.
My guy is Edgar Ramirez. If we're talking Oscar
Edgar Ramirez would have been a dope. I mean, and that's what I'm saying. Like, Doctor Strange did not have to be a white guy. Of all of the Marvel heroes that are on deck that are coming out, he was one that was traditionally white that didn't have to be. And, like, they found the whitest person. In like, I said this about Finn Jones as Danny Rand. It's like, they're not even casting Americans to play these kids. And, like, that's fine with people? Like, why is that okay? Like, I'm actually saying find an Asian American guy, right? Find, like, Harry Shum or somebody. Keanu Reeves could have been a dope Doctor Strange. Find an Asian American guy to play these characters. They're like, no, we'll cast, like, British white guys. Why are fanboys cool with that?
That has always been weird to me, why Americans are so keen on the whole on the whole British. And you know what's so odd about that is that all of these guys too, like they all go to the same rich boarding school in England. Like, the oddest thing. Like there's a whole set of them right now that make all the movies, and they all come from this really small elite club. And I don't know why America, of all places, is like so into that.
I have a theory, actually. The only thing whiter than an upper class white American is a British person.
But I mean, I think some of that stuff is going to change because people of color are gaining in the world, right? Especially mixed race, and there's scientific proof that like white people are going to be the minority, and I think they're just flipping out. One of my friends said they're flipping out. They have to have everything white. But I think that this whole thing will catch on, hopefully also in terms of like how the audience reacts. I mean, this is the problem. Like everybody runs to these films anyway, and I hope that we can get more people to care. But I also feel like we need to be more on these companies too. Like, God, it would be so easy if they would actually have somebody who advises on this stuff, you know, and who really knows the stuff. I mean, this has been my issue fighting for women directors. Or like, you know, I don't know if you saw this tweet. It's funny, we're just going out with a pilot about an Arab American cop, and it just so happens it coincided with this article in The Economist about Kerry. I mean, Secretary of State Kerry comes to Hollywood to speak to Hollywood big shots that we need a better representation of Muslims and Middle Eastern people, and it literally, it said in the article, after 14 executives, 12 were white males. And it's that thing, like, how are they going to like understand what he's even saying? But this is the biggest problem. Like, even any of you, if you could be on a, you know, reclaimer of a, you know, be on a, like a consultant fee on
I'm
any.
available. I am available. I just want to let everybody know.
Hey, you know,
As am I. Let's put it out there. You can reach me at keepthatsecretidentities.org.
That should be a thing, because I also think like Scott, for example, would have been somebody who would have, like, you know, called somebody like that. Like, I think there's stages of, you know, I'm sure there are things now that he says, oh my God, I wished I would have seen that before. Like, I mean, I think it was you, Keith, who put up that picture of her next to David Carradine.
Yeah, that was me.
You know, I mean, there's certain things that, God, if he would have known you at the very beginning of pre-production, you could have flagged that and said, oh, I wouldn't do that. You know, even if you had to cast her, and if they told you who to cast, you know, you could have been there saying, the one thing I wouldn't do is have her bald and be in this outfit, you know. Like, there's so many things that could be avoided, and also, like, in terms of story writing, even if it has to be a white guy that's their lead, because they are set on giving Benedict a movie, and who knows when we can change that, you know. I hope it will. By the way, I think big props to Into the Badlands.
Al Gough and Miles Millar, I think they deserve a lot of, as two white guys in the industry who are executive producers, they deserve a lot of credit for partnering with Dan. And, you know, when Into the Badlands came out, they were even saying, like, they were set on casting a person of color, an Asian American, in the lead of their martial arts show. And they not only did that, but they cast, you know, 2 Asian American male leads. Aramis Knight playing MK, the second co-lead. And then they also made one of the most feminist action shows of the year. If anyone actually watched Into the Badlands, like, you all knew the women were the dopest ones in that show.
Yeah, so, I'm meeting them next week. I can't even contain my excitement about that.
My God.
Meantime,
awesome.
By the way, Iron Fist not called once.
Well, yeah, well, we know where Iron Fist can, anyway.
But yeah, so, you know, we don't talk. That's like the one show that's done it right and nowhere else. But, you know, in the spectrum of it all is like, we really have to talk about, you know, how we can, you know, if there's really going to be mostly white guys making these Marvel pictures, you know, how can we help them to have access to people and, like, helping them to do this shit right? But at the same time, I don't want to see this stuff every week. I'm so tired of it. I mean, aren't you guys tired of it?
I think part of the problem, and you mentioned this with the whole Tilda Swinton looking like David Carradine thing, is it's the context is how like Doctor Strange and Ghost in the Shell. We're not arguing these things in a vacuum. These are part of a long history of whitewashing, and it's not just Asian Americans. You know, brown face, yellow face, black face. These are all things that happen and continue to happen in a lot of cases to this day. Is still standard practice in Hollywood. You know, we talked about, of course, you know, Asian Americans being erased in these things, but like you mentioned, you know, Arabs. There's that Tina Fey rom-com that just came out last year. That brown.
I have hate attacks about that movie.
Yeah, it's like it brown-faced the Afghan characters in that. Like they couldn't find Middle Eastern actors to play these characters. No, they had to brown-face these characters. So it's like these are
left and right. I mean, Gods of Egypt was like. I mean, that thank God everybody understood that was the biggest joke on the planet. But like. You literally went to Denmark and got a fucking Viking to be in this movie, like as a god of Egypt, and then they put a spray tan on him, like as if it wasn't insulting enough. Now you're making him orange, you know. And then I watched something which I really loved, this show called The Night Manager. And the book had, it all kicks off with a French Arab woman who is the first kind of person who gives these papers out. And I said, oh, she's interesting. Who's she? And of course, I look her up, and she's Portuguese. Like, I mean, there's literally like anything but an Arab at all times, and it's really a problem. And there's also a kind of laziness of not finding those actors. I mean, I don't know how you cannot find Asian actors. There's definitely, I think we just have to continue to be loud about it. But I do want to say that Scott Derrickson is actually somebody who, first of all, I don't think he would be ever on the defensive about people being loud about this. I'm hoping that he will do both of your podcasts when he can talk.
Yes,
I actually had planned it. I almost called you, Keith, before because he wanted to do it weeks ago when this first started, and I was this close to like letting you know like he's coming on the Nerds of Color podcast, but then of course Marvel said don't say anything, and so because I mean they are all under contract not to say anything, and now it's probably becoming like now everybody's turning everything into a headline.
Well, I think kind of going back to your question about how do we get consultants, how do we get the right people in the room to talk about these things and avoid these kinds of issues, I think what's going on right now, and it is unfortunate that Derrickson, I don't know him personally, but if he is what you were describing him as, it's unfortunate that it's his film that's taking the brunt. But I do thank Cargill for being so easy to disprove in his whole rant about Doctor Strange. But people now are being able to see what the arguments are, and whereas 6 months ago I would make these same arguments and people would shout me down because they're like, the United States is not racist against Asians, you need to shut up. Some of those same people are now taking a look at everything and being like, okay, well, now I see that there is a problem because there are these news hooks that smart Asian Americans like Keith are able to grab onto and really talk about the issues. So in a way, I think this is the first step to what you're talking about, Lexi, because this kind of press is what's going to convince them that they need that kind of consultation in the first place. I don't think that they thought that this was going to cause any issue at all, because historically, there were no boycotts when American Ninja came out, right? Like there just wasn't that kind of mechanism, and a lot of us, without the internet and without all that stuff, we kind of stayed in our corner and tried to maintain the model minority status quo. But now it's becoming so impossible to do so, and we're finding each other is the main thing, right? You can't just look up someone with an Asian name on Twitter and assume that they're going to be kind of on the same page as you. So that can be difficult, but man, our community is starting to really grow, and it's really inspiring on that front. So I hope.
And at some point, I think it's going to feel stupid for those people who argue against their own people. I mean, there's a lot of internalized racism, as there is a lot of internalized misogyny. Like we know about all of this. One of the biggest, like I think maybe even the number 2 at Warner Brothers is Japanese.
Something that we've talked about before on the Hard NOC Life podcast is that as much crap as we give Marvel on the diversity angle, and as much crap we give DC for just having shitty superhero movies, I will give DC and Warner Brothers props for something like Aquaman, in which they said, we have this blonde white superhero who's an icon. I mean, people got jokes, but Aquaman is an icon. You could show a picture of Aquaman to someone in the middle of Podunk, Mississippi, and they're going to know who Aquaman is. Mm-hmm. And they said, let's cast a native Hawaiian guy. Let's put Jason Momoa as Aquaman. And not only that, but let's imbue his story with like Polynesian mythology. And then they have Dwayne Johnson that's going to be leading a movie soon in their universe. The Suicide Squad that's coming out this summer. You know, they race bend several characters and spotlight several, you know, characters of color like El Diablo. I feel like in a weird way, as much as I dislike DC's approach to superhero movies, from a diversity angle, Warner Brothers is like light years above where Marvel is. You know, they may be behind the 8 ball as far as like telling coherent superhero stories, but
what a bummer! What a bummer! Like we need to bring those two elements together.
Right.
Yeah, I know. I've been thinking the other day about. I had a conversation with somebody about Punisher, and it occurred to me that actually right now, although don't get me wrong, I love Jon Bernthal, and I would love if he gets his own show. I think he's the perfect Punisher for how we know the Punisher. But to be honest, in current times, the last thing we need is a white guy shooting people to death.
Yes.
It's true, because what you really don't want right now is I mean, we don't need a white guy going crazy and shooting people. You know, that's like for today, if you look at the news, that does not make sense, you know.
The only way you can have a character going around shooting people and not himself getting shot by the cops would be to have him be a white guy.
But that's the whole point. That's the whole point. Like,
I'm saying if the Punisher was black, it wouldn't even last an episode.
Well, he should, but he's the Punisher. That's the whole point. He could shoot the people who shoot, you know, kids. Like that's the thing. But really, it's an old-fashioned idea. I mean, that all of those things could be rethought. And I agree with you, Shaun, completely. And I've said this before, that comic book writers actually have a better handle on how to bring these characters up to date with what's going on today in the world. I mean, Jeff Johns, I don't know why he gave up on it, but when he first took over, because he's Lebanese himself, he made Green Lantern Lebanese, you know, like there are certainly these aspects that I think are great. But I was also thinking the other day of like, who do we have as Asian filmmakers? And I was thinking of Justin Lin, and I basically started at the same time. He had Better Luck Tomorrow, and I had Queen Street out. You know, that was such a great representation of Asians, and he never did that again. I mean, there's nobody better from a filmmaker's point of view to represent Asian Americans in this kind of subculture, because that's what Better Luck Tomorrow was about, right? We had never seen young guys like that. And for him not to like tap into that, or to like go on these projects and say, hey, you know, I have this idea. Why don't we turn the craft into like a clique of Asians or something, like, you know, whatever you could do.
But I feel like Justin did do that with Fast and the Furious in a way, because that's always for me the proof that the bullshit about like people of color don't sell at the box office. Like, just, you know, Fast and Furious as an example, that's made $4 billion, and it's like there's like one white dude in all 7 movies, you know. And I think part of like I get your point. Justin never made like another Asian American film, but in a way, what he did with Fast and the Furious, and it was really interesting because he did it with Tokyo Drift, which of all the 7 movies is the most white guy centric. White guy goes to Asia to be the best Asian kind of like trope. But what he did is like that's where he put Sung Kang in it, and he was like, I'm going to actually make this guy where I'm going to branch the rest of the franchise off of this guy. Right, and not the white guy in the center, but like the cool Asian guy who was like better than everybody else in the film. And then like, because the Fast and Furious movies did not become these box office behemoths until they started centering the other people of color in the movies, right? Yeah. Because like the first 3, to be completely candid, were like all about Paul Walker. You know, he was the main character. He was the guy that the audience was supposed to be the, you know, vessel for. And then in the Tokyo Drift, it was Lucas Black, who was the other white guy that you're supposed to be, you know, the audience kind of like stand-in. And like I think what Justin did was like, you know what, from part 4 on, we're going to make this about all these other like beautiful brown people, and like put the white guy, you know, in the background. And I think that's credit to Justin. But I do get your point about he never made another Better Luck Tomorrow, which I think
he would be the right guy to take a Marvel movie or a DC movie and like really like, I mean, if you're talking about like taking Asian tropes and turning it around and like making a movie to say, here's how you update Asian American stories, he'd be the guy. And I'm sure he gets courted for this stuff. You know, I don't know the details about Fast and Furious. I just think that that was a brand even before Tokyo Drift came, so I'm not sure I can necessarily. He probably made it better and put more diversity in, and it made even more money. But you know, it was a brand that he stepped in. I'm talking about like, let's reinvent something and turn you know, the Runaways from Marvel into Better Luck Tomorrow. You know,
that would be awesome.
That would be awesome, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I constantly think about this, and you know, like how could you flip it? And it's probably in all of our mind to do this work, and you know, it's not that difficult. I just think as long as most white guys are still in charge, we should at least. Like, we should be loud about, like, I can't believe Alyssa Rosenberg really took this opportunity, and instead of highlighting voices like you guys and saying, here's why they're right, and here's why, you know, like, this is what should happen from white entertainment reporters, they should highlight our voices, especially the voices that are, you know, when it's about Asian erasure, voices like you two who really know what you're talking about, being Asian Americans. Instead of saying, hey guys, let me teach you something about Chinese box office, like that's the wrong approach. Because I think what really becomes powerful is not Twitter. What becomes powerful is if you asked Keith to write for the New York Times, or if other people, and this often happens, is pick up on the knowledge they gain from people like Shaun and John and you, Keith. And that's okay too if they turn it into articles, but at least they should represent that point, because my hope is that the people who are not in our echo chamber on Twitter, that they pick up a certain Entertainment Weekly, and hopefully one of these guys has the brains to say, here's what they're saying, and we should maybe listen to it.
Well, here's one of the reasons why we're still fighting an uphill battle is that Cargill's interview happened a couple of weeks ago, and it first hit the film kind of film outlets like IndieWire, those kinds of sites. It hit those sites initially as Cargill's explanation for the Ancient One is that it was unwinnable, and that didn't get any traction whatsoever. And then a few days ago, one of those film websites, and I can't remember which one it was, it might have been the Hollywood Reporter, one of those kind of republished the story with the headline, or not republished, but brought it back out with that headline about China and Tibet. And that's when everybody picked up on it. So when you look at the media covering issues of Asian American and Asian representation, they did not care about Cargill coming out and saying, you know, we don't really care about these people. They really grabbed the hook of when it became about big scary China and finances and all that stuff, right? I mean, if you type in Google Doctor Strange whitewashing, the headline for every single result that comes up on the front page right now is about how Cargill was essentially telling the truth about the fact that it was about China. We now know that he wasn't telling the truth, even by Marvel standards. We know that that was not the main thing that he hammered on in the interview. That was a throwaway line in his interview. But the thing that the media decided to pick up on was something that really, again, it's so funny. It's such a meta circle because the media picked up on the yellow peril aspect of it by making China the boogeyman. So that's how far behind the eight ball we are. Like when our stuff gets covered, it needs to invoke this scary Asian aspect to even get in there.
People's idiotic stuff about this is so unbelievable. What about when Max Landis explained to everybody, guys, listen, let me explain to you, okay? The Japanese don't see anime characters as Japanese. They see them as I'm like, you got to be kidding me.
That's Max Landis, like, intentionally not understanding. Like, it's so centered in whiteness to believe that that's true. There's a blog that I think is really great called Culture War Reporters, and I think it was them, I hope it was them, they had a line where they showed a picture of The Simpsons and said, isn't this an Asian family then? Because you believe that all anime characters look like they're white, here's these yellow-skinned cartoon characters, so shouldn't they be seen as Asian? When you're centered in whiteness, everything's going to look white.
That's always been issue number one, whether it's Doctor Strange, Ghost in the Shell, Asian Iron Fist. It's this idea to move the center away from whiteness and be about just like making other people at the center of their own stories should not be a radical idea. But unfortunately, you know, in the 21st century, it's still a radical idea. Speaking of radical ideas, this coming week, to kick off Asian American Heritage Month, we're launching a hashtag Whitewashed Out. I'm working with Ellen O from We Need Diverse Books, and we're going to be launching this hashtag on Tuesday with a Twitter chat with Margaret Cho at noon Eastern Time with the Nerds of Color and Margaret Cho at Margaret Cho using that hashtag Whitewashed Out. And we're going to be asking people to share their stories, to ask questions of Margaret, to talk about this issue of whitewashing, which again is not exclusive to Doctor Strange, Ghost in the Shell. It's not even exclusive to Asian Americans, as you mentioned, with Gods of Egypt, Whiskey Tango Foxtrot, all of these films that continue to come out in the 21st century, still whitewashing, still brown-facing, still yellow-facing. These are still things that are happening in the 21st century.
Great idea. I love this idea. I'm totally there. So Tuesday at noon?
Tuesday at noon Eastern Time, so 9 o'clock West Coast, we'll be chatting with Margaret Cho, and hopefully we're going to be doing these weekly with prominent people, just to get talking about this history of whitewashing, also suggesting stories and suggesting ideas for stories that can be told that don't have to be whitewashed. This is something Shaun can probably relate to as well as Lexi, is this idea that, like, hey, stop race bending our characters to make your own. And we're like, okay, here's a bunch of characters we created. Oh, let's cast Scarlett Johansson. You know, so it's like you can't win for losing. So that's what Tuesday, May 3rd, we're going to launch hashtag Whitewashed Out, and hopefully Shaun and Lexi, you guys will be a part of it.
Absolutely. That's a great idea.
Yeah.
You know, just wanted to say one thing that was important to me is that Scott Derrickson happens to be a really, really good guy. So I just wanted to let everybody know that.
Part of the issue with people who are even well-intentioned is, like you were saying earlier, just an unawareness. And hopefully what the Nerds of Color is doing, hopefully what No Totally is doing, and what you're doing, Lexi, is raising that awareness. And that's what we want Whitewashed Out to be doing, is raising that awareness.
I don't think he would ever want us to stop talking about it. I just feel like in the presence of his writing partner's unfortunate podcast event, I had to just say that do not throw him in the same pot. But he would never not want people to talk about this. I think he's really super happy that this is happening, and that we should make as much noise as possible. But just I want everybody to understand he's pretty much the opposite of Robert Cargill when it comes to any of these issues.
We'll let you guys go on that. One more time for Lexi Alexander, can you tell everyone how to find you on Twitter, as if the people watching the show aren't already following you on Twitter?
At Lexi Alex. And by the way, Keith, we have to do some Nerds of Color t-shirts. I will make them.
I also want to thank Shaun from No Totally. Again, can you give a quick plug for your podcast and where we can find you online?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm on Twitter at NoTotally. That's where I tweet about all this Asian stuff. The podcast, you can find it at nototally.com. You can find it on iTunes, anywhere excellent podcasts are sold or downloaded.
All right. And again, I'm your host, Keith, and thank you for listening and watching the Hard NOC Life. I'll see you next time.
See ya.
NOC in full color, you see me? The Hard NOC Life, comics, movies, and TV. Yeah, pop culture with a different perspective. Watch it on your screen, hit play, so check this. This is the Hard NOC Life, but not the chica kind. More like the people in the world seeking perspectives with a different line. The kids who share their interests together with a similar kind. When they said Don Glover for Spider-Man, they didn't mind. The activists, directors, comments, and the lectures. Fanboys, professional artists, and professors. Maybe a nerd who's just like you, talking about the things that you like too. So I invite you to the NOC in full color, you see.